Does the Prime Minister not realize that the kinds of comments made by his minister in fact point to a political campaign against a number of registered charities which the government simply doesn't like? And he does not understand the danger.
The Canada Revenue Agency is independent of the government and is tasked with enforcing the law, and the law with respect to laws with respect to registered charities are clear. In fact, we're taking steps to make sure that they're crystal clear.
The government is still fending off attacks over its alleged war on environmental groups. Sparks flew when Environment Minister Peter Kent said that some charities are actually laundering money from foreign donors. But a report out today by the Canadian Press reveals that environmental charities are actually not at the top of the list when it comes to accepting foreign donations. In the budget, the government revealed it's giving the Canadian Revenue Agency more power to audit charities to make sure they're following the rules, including disclosing where they're getting their funding from. But is the government targeting the wrong charities? Is it using the CRA for political means? Or are the changes to charitable rules around disclosing donors fair and needed? And joining me now is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Environment Minister, Michelle Rempel, NDP Finance Critic, Peggy Nash, there in the foyer, and Liberal Treasury Board Critic, John McCallum. Good to see all of you.
Hello. And you.
Michelle, let's start with you. Is the Canadian Revenue Agency targeting environmental charities above all others?
No, I mean, that's patently false. This came up in Finance Committee. Canada Revenue Agency officials were asked that very question if the minister or her political staff were involved in the audit process, and it was a very clear answer, no. I mean, we support charities. Our government supports charities and the good work that they do in our community. Thousands of people across this country, we just celebrated National Volunteer Day, support charities and the good work they do. The changes in the Budget Implementation Act describe the need to ensure that charities stay on scope when it comes to their mandates. So that's that limitation around political activities.
But then is the CRA going through all charities from A to Z and going to be combing over everyone's financial outlooks?
Again, I think the key thing to remind your viewers here is that there is no political interference in this process.
Peggy Nash, what do you think? Do you think that there has been some political prodding here to use the CRA as a political tool?
Well, Rosemary, I don't think that trust me is good enough from this government. The Budget Implementation Act shows that there's $8 million additional money going to CRA targeted to charities for political activities, and we know that it's been environmental organizations that have been targeted by this government very explicitly. At the same time, other funds, millions of dollars in funds, are cut from CRA to go after tax cheats. And we've seen, even within CRA, fraud and corruption. So why are they targeting certain environmental organizations like Tides Canada, which just won an award for transparency and for the excellent work that they do? Meanwhile, the Canadian Association of Journalists just awarded this federal government the Code of Silence Award. So if we're looking for transparency, the government should look in the mirror and not at excellent environmental organizations like Tides Canada.
Okay, John McCallum, do you think that there's some sort of political motivation behind, just sort of an overall way of seeing if people are doing business the right way? Charities,
well, it's certainly a little bit suspicious when they talk about receiving foreign money, and we just heard in the Globe and Mail today that the ones receiving the most money have nothing to do with the environment. But what I would say is, at a very minimum, the government is sending a subliminal message at the minimum to CRA that they want them to audit these environmental agencies. We don't have proof, we don't have a smoking gun that there's been a directive, but we do know that the CRA people understand what their political masters want them to do. And that could have an influence on their behavior. And so I think that is inappropriate. I don't think you should send messages through the public, if you're the Prime Minister or the Environment Minister, implying that a well-behaved CRA, if it wants to please us, will do that.
Well, for instance, EthicalOil is running a sort of a tipster line on their website, and they encourage people to send in charities that may be doing this directly to Gail Shea. What does she do with those? Does she send them to the CRA? Does she look into them herself? I mean, it just seems like there's some political involvement there.
Well, I just want to back up to my colleague's comments. He's talking about subliminal messaging. It kind of sounds like, and no smoking gun, kind of sounds like a conspiracy theory to me. When we're talking about messages, clear messages. The message that we're sending through our budget is that Canadians want to ensure that their taxpayer dollars, when they're giving them to charities, that they're being spent in accordance with our Revenue Act.
Sure.
That's what the Budget Implementation Act does.
But for instance, the Canadian Press story that John McCallum referenced, it says that the 5th largest recipient of foreign funds outside of Canada is Ducks Unlimited. So they're going to undergo some sort of audit, I imagine, to be fair. Because you can't have a rule and then just apply it to one group. Ducks Unlimited will get, those books will be looked over?
Well, again, I can't speculate on what the Canada Revenue Agency is going to do with regard to auditing. This is why we've got a decoupled political process. But just to be clear...
But do you feel you're decoupling political process now?
Again, absolutely, the minister does not have a say in who is audited and who is not. This came up in Finance Committee. This has been very clear.
Okay,
but if we're
Peggy
looking,
Nash, yep.
If we're looking for clarity, it is a minister of this government that has explicitly targeted what he calls dangerous radicals in the environmental movement and has targeted them as being the recipients of foreign money. Now, the Fraser Institute was the recipient of about $375,000 from the Koch brothers in the U.S., who are billionaire Tea Party activists. Will the Fraser Institute be audited? You know, this is a government that keeps saying, let's be clear, but in their Budget Implementation Act, they are shutting down transparency. They're removing the Auditor General's oversight. They're taking away the Inspector General from CSIS. It is a government that lives by lack of transparency, but they're targeting environmental organizations.
Okay, John McCallum?
Well, if we were in government, a minister or a prime minister would not go after environmental NGOs with speculation about money laundering and things of that nature.
You're talking about Peter Kent's comments. Yeah.
Yes. And the prime minister's also made comments about money coming into environmental NGOs from abroad. That sends a message to the CRA that the prime minister and the environment minister don't like these groups. So perhaps if you want to do a career-improving move, you'll go after them, even without receiving an explicit order to do so. I think it sets up a culture in which that sort of thing is likely to happen.
I'll let Michelle Rempel respond in a minute. But Peggy Nash, is there something fundamentally wrong with the CRA investigating how much foreign money is going into Canadian charities, or is that not a useful thing for Canadians to know and perhaps for the CRA to crack down on?
Well, Rosemary, of course, we want the maximum transparency possible with charities and with any organization receiving government money, and in this case, getting tax credits. So, of course, that's important. But when you're targeting specific organizations because you don't like their politics, that can be very dangerous. I'd like Ms. Rempel to name one conservative charity that's going to be targeted, that's going to be audited as a result of this change in legislation and under the $8 million funding.
Well, and I've been asking her that too. I don't know if you can give me an example of another organization outside of environmental ones that are going to be audited, just have to disclose where the money's from, quite simply.
Well, I'm really glad Ms. Nash is talking about agreeing with our principle that's in the budget of ensuring that there is transparency, accountability, and compliance with the Canada Revenue Agency's rules around charitable organizations.
Right. But what about the question we both asked you, though? What about the question
we both asked you?
Yeah, we all agree on that.
What about the fairness, the application of this in a fair way to other organizations, not just environmental ones?
I'm actually glad you pressed me on this, because at the start of the interview, we talked about, the accusation of political staff, political ministers getting involved in the audit process. We do not do that. So to speculate on those sorts of things is doing exactly what you're saying about.
Except the government has spoken quite freely about the fact that these are environmental groups that you're going to be looking at. Both Minister Kent, your boss, and Minister Oliver have both mentioned environmental groups in relation to this specific change. So I'm only putting back at you what they have put forward, and you, for now, haven't answered the question. Is this being applied broadly to all charities to make sure that everyone's following the same rule?
Well, certainly the hardworking staff that comprise the Canada Revenue Agency know that it's within their mandate to ensure that charitable organizations, individuals, companies comply with our tax laws in this country. That is their job, and they will do that.
Okay, Peggy, Nash, and then John.
Well, I think then the answer is no, that there are no conservative organizations that are going to be targeted. They have raised certain environmental organizations that clearly disagree with the government's policy, which they're free to do, and it's legally possible for them to do so. And it's them who have been called radicals and have really put a cloud of suspicion over organizations like Tides Canada, which is one of the best and most transparent charities.
John McCallum, and then I'll let Michelle respond.
Of course we all agree the law should be followed. Of course we all agree it should be transparent. Of course no law should be broken. I don't think it's illegal to receive foreign money, as long as you report it properly.
Disclose it.
But if everyone is obeying the law, there have to be audits. Of course there have to be audits. None of that is the issue. The issue is that these appear to be targeted audits at environmental groups by the Environment Minister, the Natural Resources Minister, and the Prime Minister, sending a message, directly or indirectly, implicit or explicit, to CRA, please audit these people and not necessarily the other people. That is what I conclude from this
Okay, last
episode.
comment to Michelle Rempel.
And what I conclude is that the opposition wants to have it both ways. The start of the interview, they're talking about not wanting one group targeted, and then at the end of the interview, they're asking for another group to be interviewed. What we're saying is there is no political interference in this process.
Well,
Budget
then why have you been
2012
politically
talks about
interfering?
ensuring that charities adhere to tax codes with regard to political activity, and that there is transparency and compliance with the Revenue Agency in an arm's-length process. That's a reasonable approach here.
Okay, well, we'll see how this unfolds, and I'm sure we'll all have you back to discuss it more. Thank you very much.
Thanks for